Hey, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at the top free form plugins for WordPress. Now, to find these plugins, I just typed form into the add plugins screen on my WordPress install and grabbed the first 6 results. You can see here I've got Contact Form 7, Fluent Forms, Formidable Forms, Forminator, Ninja Forms, and WPForms Lite. These are all well-regarded popular options for free forms. And I'm going to be taking a look at a few different aspects of each one to kind of try to decide which one's the best option for a free form plugin for your Oxygen site. But the first thing I want to do is I want to jump over to GTmetrix and get a baseline test result to see if any of these form plugins impact the performance of our sample page. So you can see here our scores are pretty solid on the sample page, though it's very basic. There aren't really any images besides an SVG logo in the header. And we've got 100%, 98% there, 519 for the largest contentful paint. The one thing I really want to pay attention to here, in addition to these metrics, is the actual page size. So if we go down, we're at 181 kilobytes. So we want to watch and see if that increases any as we activate form plugins. And that's the first test I want to do. I want to activate all of these form plugins. I'm not going to use them on the page, but I'm going to go ahead and retest the page with all the form plugins active to see if any of them are leaking any of their codes or scripts out onto the WordPress site globally, even though they're not used. So let's jump over here and just select all of these, and we'll go ahead and bulk activate them. And then I'm just going to duplicate this page and just retest this same exact page. And the only difference is that we've now activated all of our free form plugins. So here's the retest with all of the free form plugins active, and we can see a little bit of a change, but nothing too drastic. Here's before. We had a 98% on structure and 519 milliseconds on largest contentful paint. And with all the other plugins active, we're down to a 97% on structure and up to a 689 milliseconds largest contentful paint there. So that's not really too bad of an increase. Let's take a look at the waterfall and see if the size changed. So it looks like it increased by about 20 kilobytes. So we're at 181 here before and 201 after. So one of these form plugins apparently adds some stuff to the page even though it's not used on the page. Is that great? No. Is it catastrophic in this case? No. It adds, a couple 100 milliseconds and some kilobytes to your page. It's not going to make a huge noticeable difference. Plus, the real difference we want to see is once the form plugin is actually used on the page. This test just tells us that one of these plugins is a little bit leaky and maybe just adds some of its assets when it should not. So I'm going to keep these 2 GTmetrix reports up, and as we start using the form plugins on our sample page, we'll come back and retest. So the first one, let's take a look at our plugins list here. We'll just go from the top down. We'll choose Contact Form 7 first. So let's see how this works with Oxygen. First, we'll probably have to make a form. Let's see if it came with any. It did. Perfect. First of all, I love form plugins that come with a pre-built contact form because for testing purposes, it's really handy to be able to just grab the shortcode and drop it in. Now we're going to go over and we're going to edit this page in Oxygen. And I've already set up a really basic design here. We have a div on the right-hand side and a shortcode element where I'm going to drop in this form shortcode. So let's drop that in. So the first thing is we've added it to the page. Let's see how it is to style this. So one of the things I like to do with form plugins is jump to the front end and inspect their structure and see how complicated it is. Because form markup really doesn't need to be super complicated, but I've noticed that some form plugins really do complicate things quite a bit, which makes it difficult to style them. So this doesn't look too bad so far. We have our form, and then it looks like each field and label group is wrapped in a paragraph. Then we have our label, and then our span with an input inside that span. So this probably wouldn't be too difficult to style. Let's go ahead and try changing the style on the input. So the first thing I'll probably do is grab this ID And we're going to add an inspector style sheet here. And then we'll just keep it simple and do input. And let's get rid of this other stuff I accidentally pasted from the HTML. And then let's just try adjusting a style. So let's just set, for instance, border color to red. And you can see it works pretty well. Of course, the text area is not included, but our buttons and basic text fields are. So that's a good sign for the sake of styling this form. So contact form 7 is doing pretty well so far on the styling test. Let's drop in another selector here. We'll do the text area here, and now you can see everything's being styled. Let's try adding some padding. You can see we now have some bigger form fields. Let's change the font style a bit. Let's do font weight, 800. Yeah, everything's working pretty well. So you can see I didn't need a very complex selector to select and style these inputs. Now let's test the labels and see what that is like. Let's just do color red. And actually it worked exactly as I would expect. So honestly, this looks really easy to style, which means we could jump into Oxygen and use our selector detector to select any of these elements, and we'd have a relatively simple selector chain here. So this is label, we would select, our ID, and then we could go over and set our typography settings to whatever we want, red or anything like that, and style it visually in Oxygen. So now that our styling test is out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at our GTmetrix test. Let's go ahead and retest this page. Now that we have an actual form on the page, let's see what contact form 7 is doing under the hood that might impact performance. And here's the result. Looking at the comparison, it really didn't change much. So that's a good sign. That means they're not adding a bunch of scripts and things that you maybe aren't using. The size did not go up much compared to just having no forms on the page and all the form plugins active. It's pretty much the same. So that's a really good sign for contact form 7. So this is looking pretty good. The structure is simple enough that it's easy to style. It's free. It comes with a default form so you can see how to build one. And performance-wise, it doesn't seem too impactful. Now, the last thing I want to test here is editing a form. What is it like to create and edit a form in contact form 7? Now, here's probably where this will lose points over some of the other options. At first glance, this is definitely a little bit more technical than some people probably need. We're actually typing our label markup and we're putting in placeholders for our fields, which I, as someone that's familiar with writing HTML, kind of like this approach because I guess theoretically we could customize the markup. Like if we wanted to add a class to this label, we could, I think. Let's try it. Let's go ahead and check on the front end and see if this label now has a class. Yeah, so that's actually kind of a win if you're a developer type. Not so great if you're not a developer type and are looking for more of a drag and drop visual interface to create a form. Let's make sure that this is the experience when we add a new form, and it is. So for this, I guess it depends on your skill set and your approach, but could be a win, could be a loss, depending on what you're comfortable with. So overall, I think contact form 7 is a really great option based on what we've seen here today. Performance-wise, it did really well. It's simple to style, and I think it's actually kind of nice that you get to control the markup a little bit more as you're outputting your fields. The only downside is just that it doesn't have a visual form builder, which is what most people expect now. So it's time to jump into the next plugin, which is going to be Fluent Forms. Now, this is very popular in the Oxygen community, but admittedly, I haven't spent much time with it. So this will be kind of a first look for me as well. First, we're going to jump in and see if they give us a starting form to play with or whether we have to go ahead and build one. First off, it took a little bit of time to load that, but I would mostly ignore that because I'm on a server that's not really optimized for stuff like this. It's our demo server, so it's optimized to spin up a lot of small sites. but it's not really optimized like your server is going to be. So I'm going to copy this shortcode. They do give us a couple of demo shortcodes, which is great. And I'm going to go back into Oxygen and I'm just going to swap this shortcode out. Now, right off the bat, the styling here looks a little bit better than Contact Form 7. I like the rounded corners, though depending on your site's styles, this may actually be a problem because maybe you don't want a border radius on your form field. So that's where we get into the styling test. So let's jump up to the front end and we'll refresh so that we're dealing with our Fluent Form. And that actually looks really nice. I even like the blue button here, though it doesn't show in the back end for some reason. That could be an Oxygen quirk. Sometimes styles from shortcodes don't come through properly. But this looks really, really good. Now the question is, how do we change the styling? Let's take a look at the markup again on this and see if it's a simple situation or if it's a little bit more complicated. So right off the bat, this looks a little bit more complicated than the Contact Form 7, but that doesn't mean it's going to be hard to style. That all depends on how the styles are written for the default styles. So let's go ahead and fire up our inspector style sheet here. We've got the ID of the form element itself, so we can just use that and then target, just like we did on the other one, we'll target input. And then let's go ahead and set the border color to red. And that worked, not really having to fight any default styles or anything here, which is nice. Let's do the same thing we did for Contact Form 7, and we'll do the text area as well. We'll just change this input to text area, and that works just fine. Now, one thing that can be kind of a challenge is styling buttons. So let's take a look at the button. It's just a button element, so it should be pretty simple. Let's go back over here and add a selector for that. So Fluent Form _1 button, background color black. And it worked just like that. So this is really simple to style, which means, again, using selector detector would be a breeze here. So we could go in and grab, the selector from any of these elements. We've got the button, we've got the text area, and we could style all of these visually in Oxygen, which is really pretty handy. Now let's jump over to GTmetrix and rerun this test and see if we have any noticeable impact on performance from Fluent Forms. And again, really not too bad, though the performance number did drop a little bit more than what we saw with the previous test. And we have a little bit of cumulative layout shift. That's not catastrophic, but cumulative layout shift is one of those things you want to see as low as possible. We're still passing everything, so that's good. But let's look at the waterfall to see if maybe our page size jumped. So it did jump a little bit more, but really not that much. So this is not super impactful, but we did get a little bit more of a decrease on our performance scores and an increase on CLS. So that's something to keep in mind, but I probably wouldn't worry about that level of impact on my site. So the last thing we want to do is see what it's like to edit and create a form. So let's just add a new form here. This is much more modern, though it's a little overwhelming at first glance. I mean, I can see that they have, some templates, which is nice. Let's go ahead and do a contact form. And it created the form. It's going to redirect us. Yes. So this is more what we expect from a form builder plugin in WordPress, is this presumably drag and drop interface where we can move things around. We can see what the form layout's going to look like. One thing I do like is that it appears that they have a 2-column first and last name field. Some form plugins I've dealt with don't have that, and I usually want my first and last name field, if they're going to be separate fields, to be on the same row. So this is nice that it separates it into 2 columns, and I think it makes the form look a lot nicer. So overall, Fluent Forms looks like a really solid option as well. No major issues besides keep an eye on your performance scores. That drop is not huge, but if you're aiming for 100%, you'll definitely need to be mindful of that. So let's jump back over to our plugins and look at what our next form plugin is going to be. So we just did Contact Form 7 and Fluent Forms. That means we're up to Formidable Forms. So let's take a look at all of our forms here and see if we have a demo form to use or if we're going to have to build one. And again, I'm very happy that they have a demo form. Now, where is my shortcode is the question. This is the first one so far where my shortcode is not immediately visible. And I could just be missing it, but I don't see it as quickly as I've seen it on the others we've tested. So let's look at settings. Maybe the shortcode's in there somewhere. And we have an embed button here. What does this give us? Here we go. So I've never used Formidable Forms before, I don't think. So this could just be me making a rookie mistake, but this seems very buried to have to go into settings and then click embed and then click manual and then get your shortcode just feels like a lot of work. But we've got it now and we can jump over to Oxygen and drop it in here. So let's click out of here, get rid of selector detector, and let's drop this shortcode into our shortcode element. And immediately we see some differences in the styling. We have the form label, which we can probably turn off. We have some text here we're probably gonna have to style. Our labels themselves are a darker color, so we would have to style those as well. Otherwise, it looks pretty nice. We've got the 2-column first and last name, the border radius on the corners. It looks pretty nice, but I would definitely want to hide this contact us label because we already have that elsewhere on the page. So let's save this, jump up to the front end, make sure it looks the same up here. And let's take a look at the structure here. So let's inspect, since this is one of the things we'll want to edit. We have an H3. I'm not a huge fan of plugins inserting headings. I suspect that we can probably edit that. Let's take a look. We're in the settings. I assume that there's probably somewhere to change that heading tag, but if we already had H3s on the page, this could throw off our heading hierarchy a little bit. At least it's not an H1. That's good. This is where we can change our form description. Here's where we can apparently choose to show the form title, though it's doing it already. Let's try turning those off here. Let's update that with them checked, and then let's uncheck them to see if that causes them to be hidden on the front end. Again, we're trying to get rid of this title and description. And they're still showing. That could be an issue with it being the free version of the plugin. I'm not sure. Again, this is the first time I've ever used this particular form plugin. So we'll come back to here and look at the building experience in a minute, but let's take a look at the styling. Let's see if there's an ID on our form. There it is. And we're just going to do the same thing we've done on the other form plugins and do some basic styling. So we'll use the ID and then input, and just to save some time, we'll go ahead and do text area, and we'll set border color to red. And that worked without any trouble. They're all updating, though the button border did not update, though it's probably a button and not an input or a text area. So let's test that. Border color red. Yep, that worked just fine. So we're probably not going to run into any limitations styling this, though the labels definitely would need to be changed. And that's part of the reason I did this on a darker background, because in my experience, I've run into more issues with form styles needing to be changed when I'm putting them on top of different color backgrounds instead of just white. So here we have a label. So let's go back over here and change this to label. And then let's do color white. There we go. So that fixed that issue. Let's look at these little sub labels here. There's a little bit more to dig into on styling here. So this is form description, FRM description. Let's grab that, go back to sources, and let's add that selector. So form contact form FRM underscore description, which was a class. And you can see like that, we've got that going. So besides not quickly being able to identify how to show and hide the contact us title and the form description, the styling really looks relatively simple. We could go in here and use selector detector to hide these elements. So we could go to advanced layout and set display none, though our selector is a bit weird on this one. I'm not sure if that's because of selector detector or because of something to do with the form. So we would change this to something like that. And then theoretically, we should be able to go to advanced layout and display none. And we could do the same thing here with this description, we just have to make sure these goofy selectors aren't there, which I've never seen that before, so I think it might have something to do with the structure of this form itself. So we'll go over here, layout, display none. So we can definitely do it that way, though I would prefer just having that stuff not output in the markup at all if it's avoidable. And I wasn't able to get those checkboxes to do what I expected them to do. So just something to keep in mind. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and run our performance test. Now that this is used on the page, let's just go ahead and retest this page. So the results here are interesting. Our performance grade is back up to 100%. Structure staying at about 97%. It's at 98 with no forms. But our largest contentful paint does jump up, though no cumulative layout shift hit, which is nice. Let's go over to waterfall and see what our size increase is. Really not bad at all. We went from 181 kilobytes to 212. So that's just fine. So performance-wise, really no concerns. Now let's jump over and see what it looks like to build a form, which we already kind of saw earlier. Again, I like the ability to do a 2-column layout on a free form plugin. That's pretty cool. I don't know if we could maybe do that with other form fields or if it's just the first and last name, but it looks like they do have some helper classes here. And actually, look at this, add layout classes. That's super cool. I've actually never seen this in a form plugin, and that's incredibly handy for a free form plugin to have something like this. So we can do half, thirds, fourths, sixths. Let's do half here and then set this one to half and see if they go side by side. I'd like them to. There we go. So that's huge. Being able to do multi-column form layouts on a free form plugin is something that I haven't seen before. So I'm really impressed with this interface that gives you all of these helper classes, which, to be fair, most form plugins do have helper classes like this, but I've never seen them exposed in this way. Usually you have to go out to their documentation and find them and then add them and see if they work and that kind of thing. But this is really, really nice. So big points there for Formidable Forms. All right, so it's time to jump into a different form plugin. So we'll go back to our installed plugins. We just did Formidable Forms, so now we're on to Forminator. So let's see, it's all the way here at the bottom. Let's look at forms. And unfortunately, it looks like it does not come with any pre-built forms. Maybe it has some templates we can use. Yeah, we'll just use a contact us. Contact us. So even though there's nothing pre-built, we can just drop in a form that's kind of predetermined and then ideally use it on our page. So let's publish this and see there's our shortcode. So after you publish it, they give you the shortcode, which is nice. Let's see really quickly if it shows up in the form list. It's not immediately exposed, though we can get to it right here. So that's not too bad. So let's jump into Oxygen and drop that shortcode in. So this is going to be Forminator form 16. And for the first time, we get a script error. Now, sometimes, just because of the way Oxygen renders shortcodes, this can happen. As you saw, it didn't happen with previous form plugins, so it may be that Forminator just has an issue that doesn't play nice with Oxygen. So just to make sure this isn't a builder-only issue, let's jump up to the front end after saving. Hopefully we can save. Let's see if we get any major errors here in the console. Yeah, we definitely have some stuff, but that shouldn't prevent us from saving. So let's jump up to the front end and see if our form actually renders out. It does. So it renders on the front end. So you can probably just ignore these errors, though that's going to be kind of annoying if you're using Oxygen. With Forminator, you're probably going to run into this error, which is unfortunate, and you're not going to be able to see what the form looks like in the back end. So that's not necessarily a negative to Forminator in general, but for use with Oxygen, it does look like there's a compatibility issue there. So that's something to keep in mind if you're building your sites with Oxygen. Now on the front end, the form styles don't look as good as some of the other ones so far. It's a little bit narrow. I would prefer it, take up the full width. Let's see what's restricting the width here. Maybe it's a shortcode issue with Oxygen. We'll find the shortcode element, set the width to 100%. So yeah, you can just set your shortcode element to 100% width and get that width better. Let's see what our styling options are like. So here's our form. Let's find the ID. Here it is. And we'll again go into our inspector style sheet here and see if we can style some of these elements. So Forminator module 16 input, and then we'll do text area as well. And we'll just do the same test, border color red. So I'm not seeing the change. Let's see if adding important helps. Yeah, so here we run into some issues with styling and specificity. So we're not going to be able to style these inputs and text areas and things like that as easily as we maybe can with some other form elements because the default styles are more specific. Now, it's possible that we could dig in and make our selectors more complicated. So we're just using the ID and then the element tag. We could do Forminator-field as a class in between there. So let's try that. Forminator field. And then do this on the text area as well. So that still isn't quite specific enough. We could dig in and find a combination of selectors that would let us override those default styles. It's certainly possible, but you're going to end up with a much longer chain of selectors in your CSS if you're styling these with CSS. Now, when it comes to styling with selector detector, if we could see the form in Oxygen, it would probably be relatively straightforward, but unfortunately, it's not playing well with Oxygen. So that's kind of a downside here with Forminator so far. So with styling out of the way, let's jump over and see what the performance test looks like. So our performance grade dropped a little bit, structure dropped a little bit. We went from 100% and 98 to 99 and 96. Not terrible, but again, if you're shooting for 100%, a little bit of a concern. Our largest contentful paint went up fairly significantly, 300 milliseconds. Total blocking time went up from 0 to 4 milliseconds, and CLS went up a very, very small amount. Let's go ahead and jump into the waterfall and see what our size looks like. This is the biggest jump we've seen so far. So we went from 181 with no form plugins to 319 kilobytes with form plugins. Now, the interesting thing is this uncompressed size is pretty huge. So we went from 374 kilobytes uncompressed to 1.12 megabytes uncompressed. So this is a pretty big jump for Forminator. Again, probably a fine plugin to use, but if you're looking for those 100% on GT metrics and don't want to impact your performance scores heavily, this is definitely something to keep in mind, is that just by dropping this form in, we're getting a bit of a hit on some key performance metrics. Now, the last thing for Forminator is to jump in and look at building a form, which we kind of did. Let's go ahead and edit this form that we dropped in. This looks pretty straightforward. It's not quite as sleek as some of the others, but let's see if they have options for multi-column. Let's go to settings, styling, additional CSS classes. So there probably are some utility classes to get these things to sit side by side. Again, this is the first time I've used Forminator, so it may be there, but it's not immediately apparent while building the form here. All right, so that's Forminator. Let's jump into the next one, which is Ninja Forms. Now, admittedly, I'm probably the most familiar with Ninja Forms out of all of these. So if things seem to go a little bit smoother, it's not because of the plugin itself. It's just that I've used this one a little bit more. So let's go to our dashboard and see if they drop in a default form for us. That's a little bit of an annoyance there. I don't think any of the other plugins had that. So I'm going to say not now, get rid of that pop-up. We'll grab our shortcode. They do give us a default contact me form, and let's go ahead and drop this in. Now, again, no script errors. It's showing in the builder. That's nice, but we do have the title by default, which I know you can hide in Ninja Forms, so I'm not even going to mess with that at the moment. Let's see if making our shortcode wider will allow these forms fields to stretch. And yes, they do. That looks good. The button would need to be changed. So let's save this and jump up to the front end and look at styling this. So here's our Ninja form. Let's go ahead and grab the form ID and see how specific we have to get with this to style it. Now, the structure looks quite a bit more complicated than some of the other ones we've looked at. That's actually far more complicated, I would say. I'm not sure what the reasoning is for that, but we have to go far deeper in the nested structure to get to our input fields. So let's jump up here and see if we can find a wrapper here. So we'll do this one. And then let's jump into our inspector style sheet again. And there's our ID. And we're going to do input. And we'll do the same thing for text area. And the same thing for button to see if we can style that button down there at the bottom, the submit button. So border color red. And we do get the red border color out of the gate on the text inputs and the text area inputs, but we don't on the button, which is interesting. I suspect this may actually not be a button element. It is an input with type of button, which is why we didn't get the effect we expected. Now, if we go down here and do input type equals button, we might have better luck. So let's do border color red. So no, let's do important. No, I wonder if there's a border setting on this. So let's do border 1 pixel solid red. There we go. So that may have just been what we were running into up here, is that there was no border style on it to begin with. So of course the border color didn't show up, and that is the case. So styling looks relatively simple. We're not going to have to chain a bunch of complex selectors to get this thing styled. And of course, since we can see it in the builder, we should be able to style it with selector detector. So let's grab this title. And of course, we want to specify this a little bit more by selecting this ID. And then we'll go to advanced layout and display none. All right, let's save that. And let's jump up to the front end to see it in action. And let's go ahead and run our performance test. So our performance grade stays at 100%, structure still at 97, not that much different than the other plugins we've seen. A little bit of a bump on CLS and a decent bump on largest contentful paint. Let's go ahead over to the waterfall, and we see here that our page size did jump quite a bit. So from 181 kilobytes to 309, which I consider a pretty large jump. And again, that's after compression. Uncompressed, we went from 300 something to 817. So a pretty big jump there. If you're really trying to keep things lean, I think there are probably other form plugins that are a little bit leaner than this, as we've seen, but it's not a huge catastrophic impact on performance. Now let's go and see what it looks like to build with Ninja Forms, which again, I'm probably the most familiar with this one out of any of them. So definitely keep that in mind. I do know though that it's kind of tricky to get side-by-side form fields in Ninja Forms. They do have helper classes that let you do that, but they're not exposed in the builder. You have to actually go out to their docs and find them. Now, what I'm seeing here is that I don't actually have a class input, so I have to enable developer mode, it looks like, to be able to do some of this more complex stuff. So let's go ahead and enable that, and then we'll jump back in to that form and see what that opens up for us. We're going to edit this form. And now if we select this, I believe we get some more options, and now we can add these classes and things like that to get some different layouts. But again, you're going to have to go out to the docs, find the classes that Ninja Forms provides, and then drop those in to get your side-by-side layouts, which is a little bit of a nuisance and something I've definitely fought with using Ninja Forms in the past. But otherwise, it's a fairly modern form builder experience. You've got drag and drop. You can add new form fields easily, and all the things you'd expect from a modern form builder. So let's jump back to plugins and take a look at our next free form plugin. And in fact, this is our last free form plugin. So this is WPForms Lite, which I don't think I've ever used. So first, let's find WPForms, and we'll go to all forms. And in fact, I take that back. I have used the pro version of this form plugin before, but not extensively. So let's go ahead and say start building. It did not give us a default form to work with, which is a little bit of a nuisance, but it is going to make it easy for us to drop in a template. So we'll do a simple contact form, and I'm going to hit done. and done. It's giving us a pretty interesting onboarding experience. If you're brand new to building forms with form plugins, this is nice. If you're experienced with WordPress and form plugins in general, this is more annoying than helpful. I really don't want all of these pop-ups, though here it does have the shortcode for me. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, close it, and save this form. Now let's go over to Oxygen and drop in this shortcode. And it does render in Oxygen, so that's good for our Oxygen users here. It looks fine. We don't have the title and description to contend with, so that's kind of nice, because usually in Oxygen sites, at least when I build them, I'm doing the title and description in Oxygen and then just dropping the form in wherever I need it. So let's go ahead and save this and look at the structure on the front end. So we'll right click and inspect and see how this thing is built. So it looks like to me, it is nested rather deeply, but not too bad. Let's go ahead and see how it styles and if we're going to need to chain a bunch of complex selectors. Get rid of that bit and add input, and then we're going to do text area, and then we'll do button as well. Just cover all our bases from the get-go. And we'll do border 1 pixel solid red. And it does look like it's working. We'll just bump that up to 5 pixels so you can actually see it this time. It does look like it's working without too much fuss. Let's do background color black. The styles are taking without complex chained selectors, which I always like in a form plugin, because a lot of times I'm writing my own CSS to style these, and I don't want to have to write very complicated CSS to override the default styles. So this looks pretty good at a glance. So now let's jump over and do our performance test. So we're going to retest this one now that we've got our WPForms form on there. So similar story to what we see with other form plugins. We're going down from 100% on our performance grade to 99%, which for me is acceptable. For some people, they want to see that 100% number. So that's really up to you whether that's something you're willing to accept for a form plugin. Our largest contentful paint did jump fairly significantly, and we do have a decent CLS jump, though not terribly bad. So let's jump over to the waterfall and see what that looks like. And really not much of a jump at all, about maybe 50 kilobytes or so. We went from 181 to 231. So performance-wise, this option is looking just fine. Now let's go ahead and look at the building experience with this. It looks like we're in the settings of this form now. Let's go to fields. And this looks pretty typical. They do have the side-by-side first and last name field, which I like, as I've said in the past. I don't know if we can do multiple columns by default. That, again, would be a big win here, but I don't see that. Let's look at field options, advanced. There is a CSS classes field, show layouts. So again, we have some interface for dropping in these side-by-side layouts. So let's see if we can do this. Let's go ahead and duplicate this email field. And let's set this one to 50%. And then this one to 50% also on the other side. Now, theoretically, we should be seeing these side by side, because that's the first and that's the second. Let's go ahead and save this and see if it takes effect on the front end. So we do see them, though it doesn't look great. So it does have some styling options, but you're probably going to have to wrangle it a little bit to get it to look exactly how you want if you're doing things like this, like these side-by-side fields. Though I might have these backwards. Let me go ahead and swap them, because I know I added the classes in the wrong order. So let me swap them and see what that does, just to make sure I'm not making a mistake. Nope, I think I had it right. So that's something to keep in mind with this is, while it's easy to style, meaning the selectors aren't complex, if you want multi-column layout, you might run into a little bit of trouble here. So that's our last free form plugin to look at. And really, which one's the best? It depends on what you're looking for. Every single one has some trade-offs. these are what I would say are the most popular free form plugins for WordPress, seeing that they show up when you search for form in the WordPress repository. They're the first 6 results. So these are probably all solid options. They're all tried and tested, and they're used across a ton of different sites. As far as which one will work best with Oxygen, I think the only one that I would advise against at this time would be Forminator, and that's only because it looks like there's a conflict with Oxygen that causes it not to show up in the builder. So with that being said, again, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and that's a look at some of the best free form plugins for your WordPress site built with Oxygen. Thank you very much for watching.